He thought he had controlled every detail of that night, until a waitress opened her mouth and made an entire room forget how to breathe. The private dining room on the top floor of Hanseong House glowed with amber light, polished walnut walls reflecting the soft shimmer of crystal and gold-rimmed plates, every inch of it designed to impress men who were used to being obeyed. At the center of the long table sat Ethan Kong, 34 years old, immaculate in a black suit that looked carved onto his shoulders, his expression unreadable as he listened to his guests discuss shipping routes, hotel acquisitions, and family alliances in voices kept just low enough to sound civilized. He did not need to raise his voice to own a room. He only needed to look at it. Naomi Carter knew that already, and she had learned in 3 months of serving high-profile guests at Hanseong House that men like Ethan Kong did not notice people like her unless something had gone wrong. So she kept her eyes lowered, her back straight, and her hands steady as she carried a cast-iron teapot toward the private room, the scent of roasted barley and jasmine curling into the air. She was supposed to pour, bow, and disappear. That was all. Invisible was safe. Invisible paid rent on her small apartment in Queens, kept gas in her 15-year-old Honda, and helped cover the assisted living bill for the elderly woman who had once saved her from becoming completely alone in the world. Tonight should have been no different. But the moment the door opened wider and another figure stepped inside, something old and buried rose in Naomi's chest before her mind could stop it. The older man moved slowly, with the kind of quiet dignity that made everyone at the table stand at once. His silver hair was combed neatly back, his charcoal overcoat draped over broad but aging shoulders, and though time had softened his body, it had not touched the authority in his face. This was Mr. Daniel Kong, Ethan's father, the man no one joked around, interrupted, or corrected. Naomi had seen him only once before, from a distance. Yet when she looked at him now, framed in warm light, a memory flashed with such force it made her fingertips go cold. An elderly Korean woman in a narrow room in Flushing, smiling through winter sunlight, repeating the same phrase again and again until Naomi's tongue learned to shape it with care. Her grandmother by love, not blood. Her last real home. Before Naomi could think better of it, before training or caution could pull her back, she set the teapot down, bowed from the waist, and greeted Daniel Kong in a regional Korean dialect so old and specific it did not belong in a Manhattan dining room. The words landed softly, but their effect was immediate. One guest froze with his wineglass halfway to his lips. Another turned so sharply his chair scraped the hardwood floor. At the head of the table, Ethan Kang's fingers stopped against the stem of his glass, and for the first time that evening, something sharp and dangerous flickered behind his calm. Naomi felt it at once. She had crossed a line she did not understand yet. But Daniel Kong did not look offended. He looked stunned, truly stunned. His eyes, dark and tired and far older than his son's, locked onto Naomi's face with the stillness of a man hearing a voice from another lifetime. Then, in that same dialect, roughened by age and memory, he answered her. And the room went completely silent. Daniel Kang's reply did not come quickly, and that was what made it so powerful. He stood in the doorway with one gloved hand still resting on the silver handle, his gaze fixed on Naomi as if the room, the guests, and even his own son had disappeared. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, shaped by a version of Korean so intimate and regional that even the fluent speakers at the table looked uncertain. Naomi felt every eye in the room swing toward her, but she did not move. Her pulse hammered against her ribs, and still she answered him in the same dialect, softly, respectfully, with the slight rural cadence an old woman in Flushing had made her repeat for years over cups of barley tea and bowls of seaweed soup. The effect on Daniel was immediate. His shoulders, rigid from age and authority, seemed to loosen by an inch. Not much, just enough for Ethan Kong to notice. And Ethan noticed everything. He rose slowly from his chair, the polished cuff of his black suit catching the light, and studied Naomi with a level of attention she had not wanted and did not trust. A few seconds earlier she had been furniture to him, useful only so long as she remained silent. Now his expression had sharpened into something colder, more focused, as if he were trying to place a detail that did not belong in the picture. Around the table, the guests began recovering from their shock in the way powerful people always did, by turning confusion into judgment. One of the older investors gave a thin laugh and said that New York girls learned all kinds of tricks for tips. A woman seated near the end of the table, draped in cream silk and diamonds that flashed like ice, tilted her head and smiled without warmth. She asked Naomi, in English, whether someone had coached her to perform for important guests. The question was polite on the surface, but contempt lived beneath every word. Naomi felt the heat rise in her face. She knew that look. She had seen it from school administrators who assumed she was lying when she said she had won academic scholarships, from landlords who asked twice whether she could really afford the deposit, from diners who called her sweetheart while refusing to meet her eyes. She could have apologized. She could have lowered her head and stepped back into invisibility. Instead, she stood still, hands folded neatly before her apron, and waited. Daniel Kong did not turn toward the woman in silk. He did not acknowledge the investor. He only asked Naomi another question in the dialect, this one longer, stranger, threaded with an old expression that sounded almost musical. Naomi knew it instantly because Mrs. Sun Hee Park had used that same phrase whenever rain tapped gently against the windows of her assisted living room in Queens. It meant more than the words themselves. It was something people said when they wanted to ask not only where you were from, but who had taught your heart to belong somewhere. Naomi swallowed, then answered with the same care she would have used speaking to the dead. She told him, in that old dialect, that she had learned from a woman who missed the sea, missed the mountains, and missed being spoken to like home. The investor's smile disappeared. The woman in silk went still. Ethan's hand, resting against the back of his chair, tightened once before going perfectly calm. Again, Daniel Kong took a slow step into the room, his eyes never leaving Naomi, and for the first time that night, there was unmistakable emotion in his face. Not surprise now. Not confusion. Recognition. The kind that reached deeper than language. The kind that made a room full of important people understand they had just witnessed something none of them could buy. For 3 full seconds, no one spoke, and in a room built on power, silence carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Daniel Kong stood beside the table now, no longer a distant figure entering late, but the center of gravity around which every guest had unconsciously shifted. The amber light softened the lines in his face, but it did nothing to hide the emotion Naomi had awakened there. Ethan saw it too, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. His father was a man carved from old discipline, from hunger, from immigration, from sacrifice no polished dining room could erase. Daniel did not surprise easily. He did not warm easily. And he certainly did not look at strangers the way he was looking at a waitress from Queens with her hands folded neatly against a black apron. Ethan's voice, when it finally came, was calm enough to chill the room. He asked Naomi where she had learned to speak like that. Not in Korean. In English. Direct. Controlled. A question that sounded simple, but was not. Naomi turned toward him and felt the full force of his attention land on her like a locked door. Up close, he was even more composed than he had seemed from across the table, his dark eyes sharp, his posture effortless, his expression giving away almost nothing. He was the kind of man who made everyone around him reveal too much while he revealed nothing at all. Naomi knew men like that in a different form. Hospital administrators with perfect smiles. Wealthy clients who spoke gently while making other people feel small. Men who were not loud because they never had to be. She answered carefully. She said she had learned from an elderly Korean woman she had helped care for over the past 4 years. The woman had lived in Queens. Her name was Sun Hee Park. At that, Daniel's face changed again. Not dramatically. That was not his style. But the subtle shift was unmistakable, like a door inside him opening 1 inch wider. He repeated the name under his breath as though testing whether memory could still trust itself. Across the table, the woman in cream silk sat up straighter. Her expression had cooled into something brittle and displeased. She asked whether Naomi was referring to Mrs. Park from Hagen County, as if she knew the name only because it had once floated through family conversations too unimportant to hold her attention. Daniel answered before Naomi could. He said yes. Then he asked Naomi another question in the old dialect, this one so specific that even Ethan's interpreter glanced down at his untouched tea rather than pretend to follow. Daniel asked whether Mrs. Park still folded dumplings with her left hand because of the scar she got near the sea wall when she was 16. Naomi blinked. The image came back at once. A narrow kitchen. Winter rain tapping the glass. Mrs. Park laughing softly as Flower dusted her sweater and telling the story of slipping on wet stone as a teenager while carrying a basket too heavy for one girl alone. Naomi answered yes. She even added the detail Mrs. Park always insisted on after that story, that she had saved the dumplings first and worried about the cut later because her mother would have scolded her more for wasting food than for bleeding. Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest second. When he opened them, the room had changed. The investor who had mocked Naomi no longer looked amused. The woman in silk no longer looked superior. And Ethan, still watching Naomi with unnerving focus, no longer looked merely suspicious. He looked as if he had just realized that whatever had entered this room in a waitress uniform was not an accident, not a performance, and not something he could dismiss. Then Daniel pulled out the chair at the head side of the table, but instead of sitting down, he looked at Naomi and spoke in English so everyone could understand. He said, very quietly, that Sunhee Park had been his older sister. The words settled over the table with the force of a secret finally spoken aloud. Daniel Kong had not said them loudly, yet every guest heard them as if the room itself had leaned closer. His older sister. The investor at the far end lowered his eyes. The woman in cream silk went perfectly still, one manicured hand resting against the stem of her glass, as though even that small motion now required permission. Naomi felt the air leave her lungs in a slow, stunned breath. Mrs. Park had spoken of a younger brother only a handful of times, always with a softness that made the past feel close enough to touch. She had never used names carelessly. She had never told stories for drama. She had simply stared out at the winter light beyond her assisted living window and spoken of a boy who used to run down narrow roads by the sea, a boy too proud to cry when he was hungry, a boy she used to protect by pretending she herself was not cold. Naomi had listened while folding blankets, opening medication packets, and bringing warm broth to trembling hands. She had not understood then that memory had been placing her, one ordinary afternoon at a time, on a path to this room. Daniel pulled out his chair at last, but he did not sit until his eyes returned to Naomi. There was no suspicion in them now, only something far more difficult for a powerful man to reveal. Grief had polished it into restraint, but it was still grief. He asked how long Naomi had known Sunhee. Naomi answered honestly. For years. She met her while working evening shifts at an assisted living center in Queens. Mrs. Park had been assigned to another aide at first, but she did not trust people easily. She barely ate. She barely spoke. Then one night Naomi noticed the older woman pushing aside a bowl of soup because no one had warmed it enough, and instead of taking offense, Naomi brought it back hotter and sat with her until she finished every spoonful. After that, Mrs. Park began saving stories the way some people save money, cautiously at first, then all at once. Daniel listened without interrupting. Ethan did too, though his silence was not the same. His was the silence of a man rearranging his understanding in real time. Naomi could feel it. She could feel the weight of his attention moving over every detail she offered, measuring what was sincere, what could be verified, what it meant that a woman in his employ had carried a piece of his family's lost world without anyone knowing. One of the guests finally cleared his throat and said the dinner was getting cold. It was the kind of comment people made when they were desperate to shrink a moment they could not control. Ethan did not even turn his head when he answered. He simply said that the food could wait. No one challenged him after that. Naomi lowered her eyes, not in submission, but to steady herself. The polished floor beneath her feet, the scent of roasted tea, the low glow of candles reflected in glass, all of it suddenly felt unreal, as though the room had shifted half an inch off its axis. Daniel then asked the question that made Naomi's throat tighten. He asked whether he had suffered at the end. Naomi looked up immediately and answered with the gentleness that question deserved. She said no. She said Mrs. Park had not been alone. She said she was warm, that music had been playing softly in the room, and that in her final weeks she spoke often of the sea and of a brother who had once promised her he would build a life so strong no storm could ever carry it away. Daniel's hand tightened once against the carved wood of the chair. Across from him, Ethan's face did not change, but something in his gaze darkened with feeling he was too disciplined to name. Then Daniel sat down slowly, like a man carrying the weight of years inside his bones, and instead of asking Naomi to leave, he looked at the empty place beside him and said, in a voice so quiet the room had to lean in again, that she should pour the tea and stay. Naomi's hands did not tremble when she reached for the cast-iron teapot, but she could feel the eyes on her from every corner of the room, and that was almost worse. A few minutes ago she had been background, a quiet part of the service no one would remember by morning. Now the same people who had barely looked at her were measuring the angle of her shoulders, the steadiness of her hands, even the silence she carried. She stepped toward Daniel's side with careful grace and poured the tea the way Sun-hee Park had taught her years ago, not rushing, not filling the cup too quickly, letting the steam rise. First as a gesture of respect. The fragrance of roasted barley spread between them, warm and nutty, and for the first time that evening Daniel Kang's face softened without restraint. He wrapped both hands around the porcelain cup as if heat itself had become something sacred. Then he said, in English, that his sister had always complained Americans served tea like they were afraid of stillness. A few uneasy laughs moved around the table, but they died quickly because no one was certain whether laughter was welcome anymore. Naomi allowed herself the smallest smile. She said Mrs. Park believed tea was not for drinking first. It was for arriving. Daniel looked at her for a long moment after that, and Ethan, seated across from them both, did not miss the way the sentence seemed to strike somewhere far deeper than memory. He had spent years protecting his father from disappointment, from betrayal, from the exhaustion that came with carrying a family name through worlds that wanted something from it. He had arranged this dinner with precision, invited the right people, chosen the private room, approved the menu, controlled every variable that could be controlled. Yet none of it had done what this one unplanned woman had done in less than 10 minutes. She had reached his father in a language no one else in the room even knew mattered. Ethan set his glass down untouched. The sound was soft, but it drew attention anyway. He asked Naomi where Mrs. Park had lived before Queens. Naomi told him she came from a coastal county and still described the shoreline, as if she could smell salt every morning. She had kept a worn photograph in the drawer beside her bed, folded so many times the edges had gone white. In it, she was standing with two younger boys on a windy road, all three of them squinting into sunlight. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the polished reserve in his expression had given way to something more fragile, though it remained dignified. He said one of those boys had been him, and the other had been their cousin. Naomi nodded softly and added that Mrs. Park always pointed to the smallest boy first, saying he was stubborn even then. That brought the faintest curve to Daniel's mouth. Across the table, the woman in cream silk watched the exchange with mounting discomfort. Her posture remained perfect, but Naomi saw the strain in the way her fingers held her fork too tightly. Status had rules, and one of those rules was that people like Naomi were not supposed to alter the emotional center of a room. Yet she already had. One of the guests tried again to steer the conversation back to business, mentioning a hotel deal in Los Angeles and the timing of a pending acquisition. Ethan did not even look at him. His attention stayed fixed on Naomi, not with suspicion now, but with an intensity that felt more dangerous because it had changed shape. He asked what else his aunt had taught her. Naomi should have been cautious. She should have offered something small and forgettable. But Daniel was watching her with the quiet hope of a man standing near the edge of a door he had thought was sealed forever. So Naomi told the truth. She said Sun-hee had taught her how to fold dumplings, how to apologize with sincerity, how to greet elders with the whole heart and not just the mouth, and how some dialects carried grief so gently that even joy sounded humble. The room fell still again. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze unreadable, and Daniel Kong, after a silence that seemed to gather every heartbeat in the room, asked Naomi if she would tell them how she had met his sister in the first place. Naomi did not answer right away, and that pause told Ethan as much as words would have. It was not the pause of someone inventing a story. It was the pause of someone stepping carefully into memory, knowing that once spoken aloud, certain things became real again. She folded her hands before her apron and looked at Daniel with the quiet respect she had once given his sister on long evenings when the halls of the assisted living center smelled faintly of bleach, soup, and lavender lotion. She said she had met Sun-hee Park on a Thursday in late October, during the second week of a job she almost did not take. Naomi had been working double shifts back then, Mornings at a diner in Astoria, nights at the care facility in Queens, sleeping in fragments and measuring every purchase in rent, bus fare, and overdue utility bills. She had taken the overnight care position because it paid $2 more an hour than the afternoon shift, and $2 more an hour was the difference between surviving with dignity and surviving with panic. Mrs. Park had been in room 214, near the window at the end of the corridor, where the radiator knocked all night like an impatient visitor. The staff chart described her as difficult, withdrawn, resistant to care. Naomi said those words had never sat right with her. Most people called someone difficult when what they really meant was wounded in a language they did not bother to learn. The first night Naomi checked on her, Mrs. Park had refused dinner, turned her face to the wall, and answered every question with silence. But on the tray beside her bed sat a small, unopened container of plain white rice, and Naomi noticed the woman kept glancing at it without touching it. So instead of insisting, Naomi went downstairs, borrowed a saucepan from the kitchen, warmed the rice properly with broth and a pinch of salt, and brought it back with the respect of someone returning something precious. Mrs. Park had turned then, slowly, carefully, just enough for Naomi to see the surprise in her eyes. She ate the rice one spoonful at a time, while Naomi sat nearby, pretending to organize medication forms so the older woman would not feel watched. When she finished, she asked in accented English whether Naomi's mother had taught her that. Naomi told the truth. No, ma'am. Hunger did. That had made Sunhee laugh for the first time, soft and sudden, like a drawer opening in a long-closed room. After that, trust came in inches. Naomi learned that Mrs. Park hated cold tea, loved tangerines in winter, and still folded tissues into neat squares before throwing them away because waste offended her. She learned that some nights the older woman woke from dreams speaking quickly in Korean, her voice younger, frightened, lost somewhere Naomi could not follow. So Naomi began learning one phrase at a time. Good evening. Are you in pain? Would you like water? Did you sleep well? At first she copied pronunciation from videos and staff notes, clumsy and embarrassed. But Sunhee corrected her with the stern patience of a woman who believed effort deserved reward. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Naomi brought her books from the library, lotion for her hands when winter cracked them, and a small tabletop fan every summer because the air conditioning in the building never reached room 214 the way it should have. In return, Sunhee gave her stories. About the sea. About a mother who believed soup could solve nearly anything. About a younger brother too proud for his own good. About leaving one country and never fully arriving in another. The dialect came later, not as a lesson but as a gift. Sunhee only used it when she was tired, or nostalgic, or telling the truth too deep for polished language. She told Naomi that standard words were for surviving, but dialect was for belonging. Daniel listened without moving, his tea untouched now, his eyes fixed on Naomi with a grief so disciplined it became almost holy. Around the table, no one interrupted. Even the woman in cream silk had lowered her gaze. Ethan, who trusted facts more than sentiment, found himself studying not Naomi's words, but the impossible steadiness with which she carried them. There was no performance in her voice, no reaching for effect, no attempt to impress the room that had finally decided she mattered. She was simply telling the truth, and somehow that truth had become the most powerful thing at the table. Then Naomi said the one detail that made Daniel's hand tighten around his cup. She said that during Mrs. Park's final spring, when the cherry trees outside the facility bloomed for exactly 8 days, Sunhee had made her promise that if she ever met a man from Hagen County with sorrow hidden behind his shoulders, she was to greet him properly, because some people spend a lifetime looking strong while starving for the sound of home. The room stayed quiet after Naomi finished speaking, but it was no longer the same silence that had greeted her first words. That earlier stillness had been shock. This one was something heavier, something that pressed against crystal glasses, candlelight, and polished wood until even the men who had spent their lives commanding rooms understood they were no longer in control of this one. Daniel Kong lowered his gaze to the tea in his hands, as if the steam itself might carry him backward through decades he had trained himself not to revisit. Ethan watched his father carefully, and what unsettled him was not grief. He knew grief. He had seen it in the slow hardening of Daniel's habits after funerals, after losses no one spoke about directly, After each small disappearance that immigration and ambition demanded from a family trying to survive in a country that rewarded forgetting. What unsettled Ethan was tenderness. It appeared so rarely in his father that when it did, it felt like discovering a crack in stone and realizing there had been water beneath it all along. Daniel asked Naomi, in English now, whether son he had really said that, whether she had truly believed a stranger might one day meet him and carry home back to him in the shape of a greeting. Naomi answered yes. She said Mrs. Park had become very certain about unusual things near the end. She said some people stop doubting what matters when they know time is running short. Daniel gave the smallest nod, as though that sounded exactly like his sister. Then he asked one more question, and the room seemed to lean closer again. He asked whether son he had ever spoken of him with regret. Naomi felt the ache of that question before she understood it. It was not the question of a powerful man. It was the question of a younger brother who had lived long enough to fear he had become a stranger to the people who once knew him best. She answered carefully, because truth mattered more than comfort now. She said no, not regret. Mrs. Park had spoken of pride more often than anything else. Frustration too, sometimes. She used to say her brother carried responsibility like other men carried briefcases, always in his hand, never putting it down. But even when she shook her head at that, she smiled. She said he was stubborn because he thought love had to be earned through sacrifice, and she wished someone had taught him sooner that being loved and being needed were not the same thing. Ethan's expression changed at that, just for a second. It was so brief most people would have missed it, but Naomi saw the shift clearly. His eyes dropped to the table, and the hand resting beside his untouched glass flexed once, almost imperceptibly, before going still again. Something in that sentence had reached him too. Maybe because men like Ethan were praised their whole lives for what they could provide, what they could build, what they could control, until they forgot how rarely anyone asked whether they were tired. The woman in cream silk looked between father and son with a tension she could no longer disguise. She had spent the evening dressed for status, positioned for approval, certain she understood the shape of power in that room. Yet a waitress with tired feet and honest hands had somehow spoken into the center of the Kong family in a way no polished guest had managed all night. One of the investors tried to recover the tone of the dinner by complimenting Naomi's language skills, but the attempt landed hollow. Ethan turned his head then, slowly, and the man immediately fell silent. It was not anger that shut him down. It was clarity. For the first time that night, Ethan was seeing the room exactly as it was. He was seeing who had dismissed Naomi, who had mocked her, who had mistaken polish for worth and entitlement for belonging. He was also seeing himself among them, and that realization sat colder than anything else. Daniel set down his teacup with deliberate care. The porcelain made a soft sound against the saucer. Then he looked at Naomi with the weary grace of a man who had just been given back something he thought was gone forever. He said that his sister had always been right about people, even when the rest of them were too busy measuring appearances to notice character. Then his eyes lifted to Ethan, and though his voice remained gentle, it carried through the room like judgment wrapped in silk. He said, "My son, if this young woman had not spoken tonight, you would have hosted a room full of important people and still missed the only one who brought truth to your table." Ethan did not answer his father immediately, and that silence exposed more than a defense ever could. He sat perfectly still at the head of the table, one hand resting beside his untouched glass, his expression composed in the way men learn to be when an entire room has been built around never seeing them hesitate. But hesitation was there now, not on his face, not in any obvious gesture, but in the slight delay before he lifted his eyes from the table and looked directly at Naomi again. The difference was unmistakable. Earlier he had looked at her like a disruption, then like a question. Now he looked at her like a fact he had failed to account for, and Ethan Kong was not a man accustomed to missing facts in his own house. Around him, the room had begun to fold inward on itself. The investor who had joked about tips had lost all appetite for cleverness. The woman in cream silk sat with her back straight and her chin lifted, but the elegance she wore so effortlessly now looked strained, like something carefully arranged that had started to crack under heat. No one reached for wine. No one spoke of business. Even the low instrumental music drifting from hidden speakers seemed to recede, as though the room itself understood that what mattered now could not be interrupted by anything as ordinary as a meal. Ethan finally stood. The motion was smooth, controlled, almost lazy, but every guest straightened instinctively anyway. Power did not need volume when it had been practiced long enough. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve once, then turned first to Naomi, and then to the rest of the table. When he spoke, his voice was calm enough to make the shame in it more powerful. He said that hospitality meant more than polished service and imported glassware. It meant recognizing the worth of the person standing in front of you before deciding how much respect to give them. His gaze shifted to the investor, then to the woman in cream silk, then briefly to the manager standing frozen near the door, a man who had spent the first half of the evening making sure the room looked perfect while never imagining that dignity might matter more than presentation. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply said that any guest who mistook humility for insignificance had misunderstood the standards of his table. The investor lowered his eyes at once. The manager murmured an apology, so quiet it barely reached the candles. But it was the woman in cream silk who made the room tighten again. She gave a faint, brittle smile and said she had meant no offense, that everyone had only been surprised. It was the kind of sentence people used when they hoped elegance could erase cruelty. Ethan looked at her for a long second, and something in his face cooled even further. He said surprise revealed character faster than comfort ever could. Then he added, in a tone so measured it became almost merciless, that Naomi Carter had shown more grace in 10 minutes than anyone else at the table had shown all evening. No one moved after that. Naomi stood very still beside Daniel, the empty teapot warm in her hands, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they could hear it. She had known humiliation before. She had known being overlooked, underestimated, spoken over, and thanked without being seen. But this felt different. This was not rescue. It was restoration. Not because Ethan had defended her, but because the room had been forced to look directly at what it had nearly dismissed. Daniel watched his son with quiet approval, though not without sadness. He had lived long enough to know that some lessons arrived later than they should, and that late lessons often left the deepest mark. Then, with the same deliberate grace that had reshaped the evening once already, Daniel turned to Naomi and asked whether she would sit for one cup of tea after the others left. The question alone altered the hierarchy of the room beyond repair. A waitress was not asked to remain as honored company in a private dinner like this. Not unless something sacred had shifted. Ethan heard it too. So did everyone else. And when he looked at Naomi this time, there was no trace of dismissal left in his face. Only respect, sharpened by regret, and something quieter beneath it that even he had not yet found the courage to name. The dinner ended in a silence no one knew how to break. Chairs moved back softly. Jackets were collected. Quiet apologies were offered in the vague language people use when they understand too late that they have revealed something ugly about themselves. One by one, the guests left the private room with their polished manners restored, but none of them could carry themselves quite the same way they had entered. The investor who had laughed would not meet Naomi's eyes. The manager bowed too deeply when he passed her, his face pale with the knowledge that he had failed to recognize what mattered in his own dining room. Even the woman in cream silk paused at the doorway, as if she wanted to say something that could rescue her dignity, then thought better of it and disappeared into the amber corridor beyond. When the last of them were gone, the room seemed to exhale. Candlelight flickered against the walnut walls. The untouched dishes gave off the fading warmth of a meal no one would remember. What remained was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more real. Daniel Kong sat with both hands around his teacup, looking not like the father of a feared man, not like the center of an empire, but like an older brother who had just heard his sister's voice after believing the world had buried it forever. Naomi stood near the table for a moment, uncertain whether to stay where she was or retreat into the safety of routine. Then Daniel gestured gently to the chair beside him, and she sat. Not like staff, not like someone awaiting instruction, like a guest invited into sacred space. Ethan remained standing at first, watching the two of them with a stillness that had changed completely since the evening began. He had spent years mastering rooms like this one, reading weakness, controlling pace, shaping outcomes before others even noticed choices had been made. Yet tonight had moved without his permission, and for reasons he could not ignore, he did not resent it. He crossed the room slowly and took the seat across from them, not at the head of the table now, but opposite Naomi, as if instinct itself had rearranged the order of things. Daniel asked her what song he liked to listen to near the end. Naomi told him about the old recordings she played on Sunday afternoons, songs with trembling strings and voices full of distance, and how Mrs. Park always closed her eyes at the same part, right before the chorus, as if memory hurt most when it was about to turn beautiful. Daniel gave a low, breath-soft laugh and said his sister used to sing those songs too loudly while washing rice. Always off-key, always convinced no one minded. Naomi smiled then, fully this time, and something in the room warmed in response. Ethan watched that smile with an attention he did not disguise. It was not only because it transformed her face, though it did. It was because it belonged to someone who had carried kindness into a room that had not earned it. Someone who had preserved another person's history not for status, not for gain, but because an old woman had once been lonely and deserved to be remembered with care. That kind of loyalty was rare in Ethan's world. Rare enough to disturb him. Daniel eventually rose, slower than before, and rested one hand on the back of his chair. He thanked Naomi in a voice stripped of ceremony. Not for speaking Korean. Not for making the dinner unforgettable. He thanked her for staying with son, when family was far away and time was short. Naomi felt her throat tighten, but she answered steadily. She said no one who had loved that deeply should have been alone. Daniel nodded once, as if that answer confirmed everything he needed to know. Then he touched Ethan lightly on the arm and told his son they would speak tomorrow. It was not a dismissal. It was trust. A passing of something invisible from one generation to another. When Daniel left the room, the silence that remained between Naomi and Ethan was not empty. It shimmered with everything the night had exposed, and everything neither of them yet understood. Ethan looked at the folded napkin beside Naomi's plate, then at her hands, then finally at her face.